Can you hear me better now? All right. The same? All right. Okay, so my question was, what do you think of when you hear to connect the dots? So I heard someone say it's a childhood game. I heard someone else say integrating the summit. There's showing linkages. What else do you think of when you hear to connect the dots?
Well, if you're doing a project of some sort, it means following the steps to get to a culmination, an end, a completion.
Building consensus.
Building consensus?
From a vast array of dots.
So
Looking
random dots.
Yes.
Looking at the bigger picture so you understand and can be radical, meaning going to the root cause of the problem.
Looking at the bigger picture so you can understand. Great. All of these are great answers. So to start, I want to share a little bit about myself. So, like I said, my name is Julie. I came to the US from Vietnam as refugees with my parents. And we settled in Seattle. In 1986, my parents started the first Vietnamese language newspaper in the Pacific Northwest, the first private Vietnamese language newspaper in the Northwest. And growing up, I never thought that I would actually work at the newspaper. And in fact, I decided to do something totally the opposite. Rather than getting at the recent news, I decided to actually train to become a historian of modern intellectual Southeast Asian history. That's a mouthful. But as I was finishing up my dissertation, I realized that I wanted to do something a bit more dynamic. And so I decided to go back home to Seattle and get my real-life MBA by running the family newspaper. So this was in 2008. If you remember, 2008 was not a good time for newspapers. It was not a good time. And I really had to learn how to be scrappy. So I never considered myself to be a community activist. I never really volunteered when I was an academic. But there was this editorial that appeared in the Seattle Times that just really annoyed me. It was bemoaning the decline of journalists of color in the newsroom because of funding cuts. And I just thought, there are tons of journalists of color. They just happen to be in ethnic media. So I actually ended up writing a counterpoint to that. And it was the start of talking to other people running ethnic media outlets in other communities and saying, do you have the same problems that I'm having? And it was like, there's a lack of advertising. How do we serve our communities? How do we connect to government? How do we connect to bigger organizations? How do we connect with each other? It was actually the first time that I actually really started connecting the dots. And we ended up creating this coalition of 25 different ethnic media organizations in Seattle that built what I didn't know back then it was called a public-private partnership, but that's what it was. It was bringing together government agencies, nonprofits, and private companies that wanted to reach out to our audiences. So this was great. This was fun. But after 3 years, I realized, okay, I'm working with 8 people. Half of them have the same last name as me, and I really need to move to a bigger organization if I'm going to continue to learn. So being in Seattle, I networked my way into working at a local Seattle company. You may know it, Microsoft. And I started to advocate on behalf of another underrepresented minority, Windows Phone users. So people ask me, well, how did you go from being a historian to a journalist to a marketer? And I used to say the common thread was, I'm a storyteller. I'm a storyteller. But you know what I realized is I actually don't really like storytelling. Or I should say, it's really hard. It's super hard. It's actually exhausting for me to put together a story. I am embarrassed by how many interviews I've done where I have the notes and I actually never wrote the story. I love the interviewing part. I love asking questions. I love all of that's really super energizing. But putting together the story and sharing it, oh my gosh, so much work. So I've actually come to realize that what I am at my core is I'm a dot connector. I actually like finding out what all these different people need and connecting the dots. And in community media, it's a platform for diverse voices from the community to be shared. There is so much potential, though. Like embedded in those stories are all these needs and wants and desire for connection. And there's so much potential to not just share the stories, but to also fulfill those needs and those wants. So, at WTIA, now I'm at Washington Technology Industry Association. It's a nonprofit that advocates on behalf of the tech industry, so I'm still in tech. I head community engagement. Community engagement, typically for private companies and for organizations like mine that represent private companies, is all about making the company look good. You know that, right? It's like a big PR effort, right? Yep. And we actually asked tech industry workers, what do you actually care about? And there in Seattle, it's undergone so many changes. The tech industry has really been booming, and we're bringing so many people. It's 1,000 people a week. And what we hear from techies is, I feel isolated. I want to help, and I don't know how. I want to connect, and I don't know how. I want to collaborate, and I don't know how. And so what we decided to do was create a way for people who normally wouldn't collaborate to come together. So connection starts with sharing stories and building that empathy for and among strangers in a community. But collaboration is actually getting those strangers to do something together. So what we did was we created this collaboration program that is called ION. It's a fellowship. And we said, hey, who from tech, government, and community-based organizations you really want to work together? It doesn't actually really matter on what. You just want to do something. And so we were able to recruit people and get them to commit their time for 6 months. And when they started, they actually don't know what they're doing. We actually asked them for the first 2 months to just go out into the community and to talk to people and listen and just have these small 2-3 person conversations. What are you hearing? What are you seeing? What are you feeling that the general public doesn't know? And then after all of that, then they can decide what they want to work on. Normally people start with the problem first. We started with the people. So then I'll just give you one example. This one cross-sector, cross-functional team of 6, they talked to 18 different organizations. They talked to the Seattle Public Library. They talked to tech companies. They went to the largest social service agency for Asian Americans. Yes, ACRS. They went to all of these different organizations. And what they came back with, the common thread that kept coming up was, people want to feel included. And to feel included, that is reinforced with the act of invitation. They want to be invited in. And so what this team decided to do as their project was to actually create a small group story sharing format. Someone's called it storytelling. It's like the moth for introverts. So people who normally wouldn't get up on a stage, but who are willing to, if they're invited, to share with 2 to 3 people. Are you surprised that this group that's organized by a tech association would come up with a non-tech solution? Yeah. We said, it doesn't really matter what solution you come up with as long as you collaborate together, and it's also in co-creation with the community. So this was a team of strangers that committed to this. So who's heard the phrase, and do you believe in the phrase, to get something done, you got to know someone who knows someone? Yeah. So what if everyone you know is like you? Yeah. Or actually, more specifically, what if people you know that you're willing to ask for help from are going to be like you? Yeah. So, like I said, connection starts with that short story sharing, but how do we move it from just sharing stories to actually collaborating and asking and giving help among strangers? It is that story sharing is just the first step. So all of you all know this already. You all know about connecting the dots. What usually happens though is we don't make the time for it because we're speeding through and trying to get things done. We don't actually take the time to listen to each other, to wait for that serendipity of the emergence of ideas to come up. So you just spent 2 days learning how to strengthen your community media organization or contribute to your own professional development. You've learned about grant writing, about how to run volunteer teams, about citizen journalism, VR, a whole range of topics, right? And usually what happens in a conference is then you go home and you think that was great and you apply some of the things and that's it. So what actually the bulk of this talk is going to be is facilitating an opportunity for you to connect the dots with each other. So we're going to actually break into small groups. So the way this is going to work is we are going to count off 1, 2, 3, and just make sure that you are not in the same number as someone that you work with, because we want to make sure that you're in different groups. And we're going to have 3 rounds. And originally the rounds were going to be 15 minutes, but I'm actually going to cut it off to 12 minutes a round. And the idea is for groups of 3 to basically share and answer different questions. So the first question to warm you all up is, what'd you learn? What'd you learn at this summit that you want to take back? How do you think you will use it? The great thing here is then you get to hear what other people learned, right? Second question is going to be, talk about your work organization and what are you experiencing right now that is difficult and that's something that you can use help with. And that's going to be the second rotation, so you will be with different people. And then we'll rotate one more time. And the third one is going to be like the second question, but you get to talk about a organization that is maybe something that you volunteer for, something that is not related to work. And if you really can't think of anything outside of work, then use work again. But I hope that's not the case. This means that you can talk about maybe you're in the PTSA, or maybe you're in a soccer club, or your church, or your temple, or a nonprofit that you are serving on the board of that's totally unrelated to community media. And the idea here is that we'll all get to hear all of these different, you'll get to hear what the dots are. You'll get to basically hear all of these different needs and wants. And my hope is that you will get to leave here connecting with 6 people that you didn't know before. And then we'll come back and we'll just reflect on what we heard. Sound good? Yes.
I'm sorry to ask you to repeat it, but will you please repeat the question number 3?
I've got instructions. So why don't we pass these around? So what we're going to do right now is I'm going to count people off in 1, 2, 3, but can you just make sure that you are sitting like 2 people away from someone you know, or like from someone you work with? Huh?
Third person, one.
Yeah, so what we're going to do is the group 1 will always, person 1 will always stay in the same place. And then number 2, after the second round, will rotate counterclockwise. And the person who's number 3 will rotate counterclockwise. So everyone gravitate to the 1s. Are you a 2 and a 3? Okay. You've got 10 minutes.
It's complex because, I wasn't there personally.
Clockwise. Number 3s go 1 more clockwise. Final round. You got 10 minutes. Okay, clap if you can hear me. Clap if you can hear me. Okay, great. Raise your hand if you started a conversation with someone who you think that you will want to continue to talk to after this summit. Raise your hand if you think that you can help someone or get help from someone you just had a conversation with. Awesome. That's what I want to make sure happens, because I know how in conferences we can get so heads down in the learning that we forget that connecting part. So there were. So I want to hear reflections. What was that experience like? What were some interesting things or interesting new connections that you made? It's where people get shy. There's so much chatter, and then everyone's like, "No, I don't want to say anything." Yes.
So, with like the organization stuff, I do volunteer work for some radio station, and they do radio as well. And that was something that was like, oh, well, you do radio here, you do radio here.
Yeah, and now you can connect on the volunteer, because you volunteer for radio stuff, and now you've met people who work in it. Yeah. Great. Other connections? I know you guys want to go home to get ready for the awards. Yes.
Well, I just really liked how question number 3 recognized that many people who work in the business of community media and community organizing also wear many hats, and so probably also have a lot of organizations that they also are affiliated with, and that some of these skills and some of these things that we've learned carry over not just to the media project, but into whatever else that we are endeavoring to make better.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, sometimes we just go straight into business and we just talk about the thing that we think that we know that person is related to us. But if we actually took the time to have those other conversations, like, oh, we can do this and we can do this, and I know someone else who does that. Yeah, exactly.
I like question number 3 a lot too. The 3 people in our group addressed the other organizations they're involved in, and a couple of them were churches, and one was a veterans organization, and they all had to do with pursuit of virtuous ends, and namely peace and love and understanding.
Well, that's a kind of actually a really nice way to end this session. So you are all in the business of sharing stories, and you all know about connecting the dots. But sometimes we just don't take that extra step to ask those extra questions, to take the time to do that. And so think of how you don't just share stories, but how you also you're not just a platform for sharing stories, but you're also a platform for connecting dots. So that's it.